Welcome back, folks. Before we get into the details of finding Thevenin voltages and Thevenin resistances, I want to take a brief detour and kind of revisit something that I mentioned in superposition, and you either asked me in the live session, which hasn't happened yet, or you just took it on faith, which you shouldn't have that much faith in me. You should always question me, please. I'll get you answers if I can. If I can, I'll tell you. Okay, so in superposition, I said let's replace the independent sources with their ideal resistances. And here's why that works. And it has to do with Thevenin and Norton. Okay, so let's take a look at a voltage supply. And we have ideal sources and we have more realistic sources. But our realistic sources look like this. Okay, it looks like a Thevenin equivalent circuit. And that's why we can call it realistic, because we now know that we can take any linear circuit, so no semiconductors, and we can make it look like a Thevenin equivalent. We're going to figure out how to do that in the coming videos. We haven't done it yet, but now we know that it's possible. At least, well, maybe you trusted me on that one too. Suckers. Anyhow, thanks for keep click and play, and hopefully you're learning something. I'm having fun in my basement recording these. I'm happy to do it if it helps. I hope it helps. Okay, on the left here, we have an ideal source. Okay, the idea is that we connect some resistor, let's call it a load, to a voltage supply, and we're interested in the voltage across that load. Okay, so ideally that source doesn't have any serial resistance, and we can find VRL across that load pretty easily because they're in parallel, right? These two things are connected in parallel, therefore they have the same voltage, and we can say the voltage across the load is equal to the voltage across the source. No real calculation necessary. More realistically, if I were to hook it up to some circuit, it could be a power supply, it could be the wall outlet, it could be a battery for that matter. Batteries have series resistance as well. Okay. We have this real, it's not the real thing, but it's an equivalent to the real, and if Thevenin knew what he was doing, he's a pretty sharp guy, then this is a realistic model of that voltage supply. Okay, so we're going to play the same game where what we're really interested in is the voltage across the load. Okay, so VRL is going to be measured here. And now it turns into a problem that we have to do a little bit of analysis on. But look at this analysis. It's a voltage divider. Back when we were learning voltage dividers, I said that I don't like using pre-canned formulas, but this one shows up everywhere. Here's why it shows up everywhere. If I have a Thevenin equivalent and I connect it to a resistance, it turns into a voltage divider. Plain and simple. So it does show up everywhere. So if I want to write an expression for VRL, the voltage across the load resistance, I have to use the voltage divider. So I say the voltage source is divided between the load, right? So there's the numerator. That's the one we want to find the voltage across. And we divide by the sum of the two resistances. So this is the Thevenin resistance, and we have the load resistance here. Okay, so that's the realistic situation. Now, what value, maybe you've been reading this right there, and you've been thinking about it, and you've been looking at the equations. What do we want the Thevenin resistance to be in order to return us to the ideal case? Okay, what Thevenin resistance makes these two equivalent? So look at this ratio here. If I want VRL to be equal to VS, all of this stuff in brackets needs to be 1. And if I'm going to make that 1, then it needs to be RL over RL. And if that's RL over RL, then R Thevenin has to be 0 ohms. And that's what we did in that's what we used in superposition when we said R Thevenin in this case is 0 ohms, and we called that a short. That is the ideal resistance. That is the resistance that's right there. There's no resistor there. It's 0. It's a short. Okay, so that's where that came from. If we want the realistic model to look like the ideal case, then the equivalent resistance needs to be a short, 0. Okay, 0 ohms. We can play the same game with a current supply, thanks to Norton. Okay, so over here we have the ideal current supply. That ideal current supply is supplying power to this resistor. Now, it's connected in both series and parallel. What I'm interested in now is it's connected in series. It shares a node exclusively. Happens to share both nodes exclusively. So if we're thinking back to series, parallel, neither, both, this one is both. I'm interested in the series part. And I'm interested in the series part because that tells me that the load is going to carry the same current as the source. Okay, so IRL is going to be equal to IS. All right, let's get the realistic case up above my head here. Let's keep those labels on the screen. And in the realistic case, again, it's not the actual thing, but it's a good model. It's a good model thanks to Norton's theorem. We add the Norton resistance. It's going to be in parallel with the current supply. So we have this Norton equivalent, and now that's what's supplying the load with current. Take a look at that one. That one's a current divider. Okay, so once again, I don't like pre-canned formulas. I think they limit your understanding and your ability. But this one shows up everywhere, and that's because this one is it comes out of the current. It comes out of Norton, the Norton equivalent, and the current divider. So it's useful. It is really useful. Okay, so now I write the expression for the current through the load, labeled over here, and we're going to take the source current and we're going to divide it between these two branches, and we divide it according to the ratio of resistances. Recall when we were talking about the current divider that the opposite branch resistance ends up in the numerator. Go back and look at those videos again if you don't believe me, but I derived it all there for you. And then we have that over the sum of the resistances. This changes things a little bit, but we're going to ask the same question. What value of the source resistance, the Norton resistance in this case, makes this real case equivalent to the ideal case? Okay, so we can do it, well, we got to just rip the resistor out, right? So we can do it that way, or we can look at this equation, and we can say, well, the Norton resistance has to be, well, the same thing has to happen. This all needs to be 1, right? Everything in these brackets here, these square brackets. I can't change the load resistance. I'm really just varying the Norton resistance. So if I want this equation, or this fraction, to equal 1, I need to make the load resistance insignificant. And I do that by having an infinite Norton resistance. Okay, we have another name for that, and you might remember that from superposition. I said, well, the Norton resistance, or the ideal resistance of a current supply, is infinite ohms, and we call that one an open. All right, they didn't come out of the blue. I promised you I'd revisit this. Here it is. The ideal resistance of a voltage supply is a short. I almost got it backwards. I had to think about it. The ideal resistance of a current supply is an open, and it all comes back to Thevenin and Norton's theorems. All right, we got to dig into the details. Here's where we're going to get lost, but this is what we're doing. We're thinking of these ideal components. We're making them a little more realistic with Norton's and Thevenin's theorem. We're going to dig into the details. I promised you last video that's what was coming next. That's not what came next. Now it's coming next. Stay tuned and good luck.